be joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Before I turn it over to Shannon to give the introduction, I want to let everybody know that we're recording tonight's webinar, and we're also going to be sending the slides around to participants and for those who are interested who are unable to join us this evening. And we will be putting a version of this on the PTA website. Right now, everybody is joined in listen-only mode. We're going to do that for the first part of the presentation. We're providing a policy overview. And then at the end of this, we're leaving ample time for Q&A. So at that time, you'll be able to submit a question, and we'll be able to unmute you. So, all right, Shannon, take it away.
Thank you, Jessica. First and foremost, I just want to thank the staff. It's only Tuesday, and this week has already been a very busy week for them. In between supporting our states and Common Core implementation and garnering support for the Family Engagement Act, they're also managing to message and support events around the National Voter Registration Day and the 40th anniversary of the passage of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. And on top of all of that, they still had time to host this webinar with me. So I do want to thank them for that. And I also want to thank the volunteers who have made the call tonight. I really appreciate your commitment and your dedication to PTA. So tonight, our objective is to define the current situation in terms of scope and National PTA's position statement on access to education. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar, as Jessica stated, and in addition to that, we'll send a survey out in a few days after you all have had time to digest the information. Your comments will then be cataloged by the Legislative Committee and will be used to brief the board on possible steps moving forward. As association stakeholders, it's our sincere hope that you fully engage in this dialogue, not just with providing best practice examples, because I know that some of your local units, your councils, and even at the state level, you folks are moving mountains to address the situation in those communities that have been impacted by unaccompanied youth. But I also hope that you provide us with thoughtful feedback on deliberate steps forward at a national level. And that being said, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Jessica and Molly.
Thanks, Shannon. So I'm going to kick off the policy briefing portion of this by first just providing you with some definitions that come from the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services. So as I said, these slides will be provided to you, so I won't read off every definition. However, as you can see from this slide and the ones to follow, immigration law has a number of highly technical terms that may not mean the same thing to the average reader. So these come straight from Citizenship and Immigration Services. So you can see that an asylee is an alien in the United States who is found to be unable and unwilling to join his or her country of nationality, and so on and so forth. This definition, and you'll see from the following slide, is very similar to refugee. A legal permanent resident is somebody who is considered legally recognized by Immigration Services in the United States, but is not a citizen. A refugee has a very similar meaning to asylee, and that's a word that you're going to see kicked around throughout this presentation. I want to clarify that U.S. immigration law provides a very specific definition of refugee, and this term may not necessarily apply to the unaccompanied children who have been apprehended at the U.S. border. Though these children may have aspects that fulfill this definition, and they are under the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they may not be considered refugees. So I want to just go ahead and get that up front, because that is an area of confusion, including to myself when I first dug into this work. So now the definitions on this slide are by far the most relevant for this issue. So the legal term is an unaccompanied immigrant child. And so what is that? So an unaccompanied immigrant child, UAC, is a child under 18 who lacks lawful immigration status and who either does not have a parent or legal guardian in the United States or has no parent or legal guardian able to provide care. So, I went through this so in detail because not every minor without lawful immigration status is considered a UAC. If a child and parents enter the United States together, then the child would not be considered unaccompanied. And because a child may be considered initially upon entering the country a UAC, this may not be permanent if the child is then found to be placed with a parent. So just to clarify. Now, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. This is a department within the Department of Health and Human Services, and this is the program. This is the lead agency who is responsible for placing unaccompanied children with approved sponsors. And ORR is also the agency who provides care while the kids are still in federal custody. So ORR makes placement decisions and also provides temporary care until placement can be made. And then moving forward, an ORR shelter is where children are placed temporarily until they can be placed with an approved sponsor. So I'm going to get more into detail in future slides. Now, the relevant federal laws that dictate what the process I'm about to go through are these three laws. The Homeland Security Act and the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act are both by far the most relevant, and they're the reasons that what is happening has happened under the law. So the Homeland Security Act is the act that they formally transferred care from the Department of Homeland Security, which handles adult undocumented immigrants, to Department of Health and Human Services for unaccompanied children. And the second law, the Trafficking Victims Protections Act, extended it for unaccompanied children that enter from a non-contiguous state, a non-bordering state or country, that they will be placed in ORR care. So, all right. Now, let's dig in. So, I'm sure many of you, if you're joining us may be familiar from the news, or you maybe have closely followed this situation. But there's been approximately 60,000, the count is likely more than that, unaccompanied children have been apprehended at the southwest border of the United States since October 2013. And this is a 100% increase from the year before. And just to give you an idea of in the long run, just to give you how much this has increased, from 2004 to 2011, the U.S. had about 7,000 to 8,000 unaccompanied children enter annually. So 60,000 is a significant leap from where we were 10 years ago. And the children that are coming in at this time are primarily from non-bordering countries, so from Central America, specifically El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And also, the studies and the research is revealing that the kids that are coming in tend to be younger than previously, rather than 16, 17. They tend to be 13, 14, or more than they were, and also more girls, and more have exhibited symptoms of trauma. So, the federal laws that I referred to earlier require that kids who come in from a non-bordering country must be given an immigration removal hearing in immigration court. This is different from a kid that enters potentially from a bordering country. These children may be automatically deported and never transferred into Health and Human Services care. The kids who come in from a non-bordering country are granted under federal law a removal hearing, and that is why they then go into federal care from the start. So, what happens first? After a child is apprehended at the border by the Department of Homeland Security, within about 72 hours, once the child has been found to be an unaccompanied minor, that child is turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services while they await immigration proceedings. So, like I said, this probably goes from Homeland Security into Health and Human Services in about 72 hours. And this is unlike adults who remain in Homeland Security. They are placed in ORR care, and immediately their first placement is in an ORR shelter. ORO shelters are primarily nonprofit organizations. They house about 30 to 50 children at a time, and the average stay is about 35 to 45 days. So these shelters, I'm going to clarify because these are the questions I've been getting. ORO shelters are unlike maybe a homeless shelter or a shelter you're very familiar with. Shelters that are under the Office of Refugee Services are very confidential. The department goes to great lengths to conceal these locations, and they're very private. The reason for this is they were established to be for trafficking victims. And there are about 80 across the country. And during this time, the federal government, Department of Health and Human Services, pays for the care, pays for food, education, clothing, any health services that are needed, and so on and so forth. So I've received a lot of questions and about what can be done for kids that are in shelter. And unfortunately, federal agencies, they're not allowed to accept donations. The work that can be done is when they're released to approved sponsors, which is the next slide. The one more statement I want to say about the shelters is that a lot of news coverage was about very large shelters that housed about 1,000 to 2,000 kids. These were actually temporary shelters that opened up. There were 3 that opened up on military bases during the summer while there was a heavy influx of children and the Department of Health and Human Services was experiencing an overload. They expanded their smaller shelters, and they have now closed all of these temporary shelters. So the ones that were the images in the news that was getting big, large shelters are no longer open. And so the shelters, when I say shelter, I'm referring to these smaller federal shelters. All right, so after remaining on average 35, 45 days, more or less, children are then released from the Department of Health and Human Services to an approved sponsor, which is typically parents, extended family, or family friends. About 90% of children, or estimates, are placed with a family member or friend. Only about 10% are placed with somebody in foster care. So now it is at this time that states are impacted, that states would be funding, because once children are released to a sponsor, they are eligible for enrollment in the local public school. And so therefore, this heavy influx of children, the 60,000 students, this will be impacting many of your states. Now, how long? What does that mean? Well, proceedings in immigration court can take anywhere from 18 months on average, but it can be significantly longer due to understaffing, backlog of cases, and many courts may stay longer. So even a child that may ultimately get deported and may not be able to be granted legal immigration status may still remain in a U.S. school for a number of years. So, and also the second factor is that reports are showing, I mentioned earlier that a lot of the children that are entering are showing signs of trauma. Reports are showing that anywhere from 40 to 60% of these children that are coming from Central America might actually be eligible for legal humanitarian protection, so refugee status. That's still unclear. This is still, things are still coming. These hearings haven't even started yet because there's such a backlog. But the conclusion from this is that kids, this is not just a few months. The kids are going to remain, for a year, potentially longer, depending on the situation. This map just shows you the level. This is from the first 6 months of the year. All of this information, the detailed numbers of number of kids that have entered the states, are available on the fact sheet on our website. So just to give you an idea of really which states are hit the heaviest. So this is what has Congress done. There has been little movement at this time. There have been several proposals. The Obama administration submitted a request to Congress for emergency funding, and this was right before Congress adjourned for the August recess. And Congress was unable to pass that emergency request. There have been several various bills that have been flown around, both some with funding, some areas in the funding going for services, some for border security, and so on and so forth. There's been several funding proposals, and then also several policy proposals that would modify our immigration law. However, none of those have managed to move forward, and they are not moving forward at this time. However, we have been, there is also, now that Congress has returned, they're only in session for a few more days, honestly, before the end of the term, but there is talk. This is definitely something that is going to be considered in upcoming continuing resolutions and other funding proposals. So it is discussed, but right now, there has not been a ton of movement at the federal level. So that's the quick and dirty of the policy overview in the situation. I'm going to turn it over to Shannon because she's going to go specifically into PTA's official statements on this issue. So, Shannon.
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to go off script just a little bit and reach out to everyone who's on their phone, like maybe stepped outside of their office or they're in their car. If you have questions, go ahead and email them to Jessica or myself, and we'll make sure that we get to them later. I just didn't want to forget to mention that because I know that not everyone is participating via the web platform. So whoever's just on their phone listening in, definitely reach out to us later. Make sure you let us know that you're on the call or we're on the call, and let us know if you have any questions. Okay, so as we move through the next few slides, please notice that the statement that PTA approved in 1996 is silent on legal outcomes to include permanent residency and or humanitarian legal status. So I think that's really important to recognize that PTA in 1996 and today is not taking a stand on what should happen, what should have happened. We're not trying to predict anything, and we're certainly not trying to look back and say what went wrong. The only thing that PTA is trying to do now is talk about what happens to children once they're here. Okay, so let's look at the next slide, and the next slide will kind of thread out in terms of education, adequate food, shelter, and basic health care. Well, what does that look like in a strategic sense? So you see the first bullet talks about public schools and that public schools should not be placed in the position of determining legal status. We are not trying to enter that arena. We're not asking states to enter that arena. We are not trying to take a stand on immigration policy, okay? So this position statement doesn't reach that far. The second bullet, it's in the national interest to ensure that all children, including undocumented children, have the opportunity to reach their full potential. We do speak for every child with one voice. And so I think that probably still resonates with us. Now, as a state, as a council, as a local unit, you might ask the question, well, what does it mean to ensure that? National PTA is not trying to tell you what that looks like on the ground. You have the flexibility to engage as a state, as a council, the way that you see fit, the way that your funding is orchestrated, the way that your volunteers involve themselves. National PTA is not trying to guide that, but we do stand by that tenet that all children should have the opportunity to reach their full potential. The next bullet supports the confidentiality of school records. I know that some of you folks are coming up against requests from parents regarding the medical status of children that enter your schools. I just want you to know that DHS does screen every child. I know that there's been some inflammatory information in the news lately with TB outbreaks, flu outbreaks, scabies. I do want you to know that the Department of Health and Human Services does screen every child, and that issues that might exist in that temporary holding area are attended to before they reach shelters and certainly before they're released into homes. Okay, so that being said, the confidentiality of school records for all children, that should be something that we're all comfortable with. In terms of nutrition, while children are here, PTA still believes that every child should be fed. And that will usually flow. There's probably going to be a lag time with our states, but the marriage between federal funds and state funds is probably something that we'll want to look at down the road, and we'll want to offer help on how to coordinate that. But definitely, without a doubt, all children should have access to school meals. And then the last, federal, state, and local entities have a responsibility to contribute to the well-being of children by offering health care. So before they are released, if they are released into guardian care or parent care, they are inoculated, they are given physicals, and the process of rehabilitating them, because so many of them are eligible for extended social service care, that process has already started, and PTA, National PTA, believes that all children should have access to that care. So next slide. All right, so I kind of folded in application as we covered those different points, and this just kind of sums it up. And so moving forward, there is a broad strategic position on the way that National PTA feels about how children within our borders deserve to be treated. So beyond that, in terms of engagement, in terms of funding, those are all things that have to be threaded out at a state and local level, and possibly with the help of National PTA. Certainly in terms of funding, in terms of services, in terms of tip sheets. I hope you folks are aware of the hub that we have in our advocacy section online that's got lots of online materials to help you navigate this situation. So we are trying to move forward with tools. But aside from that broad position, National PTA did not experience any movement from what was approved back in 1996. So moving forward, as stakeholders in this association, if you would like to see something different, if you would like to see something developed, if you would like to see something truncated, this is your opportunity for your voice to be heard. The legislative committee will be reaching out in terms of a survey, and we will make a recommendation to the board. Now, that's different from a resolution that doesn't necessarily launch action on behalf of states. But if approved, it does become an official position of the National PTA. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks, Shannon. And before we go into Q&A, I just want to make sure that all of you are aware of the resources that Shannon referred to, the resources that are online. All of these resources I'm about to describe are on pta.org/advocacy. There's a section on that page that links to the full page where you'll find all of these resources and information. And as more information, as we develop more information, this slideshow, for example, this information will be placed. So this page will be continue to be updated. But at the time, so first there is a fact sheet. And this is, this functions very as an FAQ document. It's going to provide a lot of information I just provided in the slides about federal, state responsibilities, when are children, when will they enter public school, et cetera, how many children, and so on and so forth. So this is the fact sheet. And then we have a resource that our programs team put together. It's fantastic, called Connecting with Children and Families Who Recently Immigrated. And they have applied the PTA's national standards for family school partnerships to this situation. And they're just tips for local PTAs on how to welcome and support families. And they also point to national and community resources that can serve as great resources to PTAs that provide valuable support. So it's a really good resource. I would encourage all of you to check that out if you haven't already. And just to highlight some of the resources that are pointed to on this document, I just want to let you know about some of the work that our partners are doing. So there's the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. They have a great program called the Border Children Relief Project. And they are in the process, LULAC is an advocacy organization that works to advance the economic condition, educational attainment, housing and health and civil rights of the Hispanic population in the United States. That's their mission. And they're actually in the process of finishing a toolkit with information about what individuals and communities and schools can do. And they're planning a partnership with food banks in some of the 5 main cities. So Houston, I know for sure, LA. These things are still in development, but LULAC is a great resource, and all of the links to these organizations are on our sheet, and they can serve as really good resources. And you should look at LULAC and both Welcoming America. Both have things that are going on in local communities, and they would be a really great opportunity for local PTAs to reach out and for partnerships. So these resources and more are listed on the Connecting with Families sheet that's on our website. But I just wanted to highlight them because a number of national and community organizations are providing support and resources for families. So please check them out and refer members to these organizations. All right, so now we're going to open it up for Q&A. And since there's a large number of you, first of all, as Shannon said, for those of you who are not joining online and you're just on the phone, feel free to shoot Jay Seitz or Shannon an email with your question. So, but for those of you who are online, the best way, please, if you see the question box right here, please enter your question in that box and we'll be able to see it. And we will read your question and unmute you. So if you have any